The pups would not stop crying, and King Draven Ashgrove was beginning to believe his own children hated him. It was the fifth noblewoman that morning, who had knelt before the carved oak cradle, her silk gown pooling on the marble floor, her painted smile aimed at the three infants who lay wrapped in soft blue blankets. The moment her hand reached toward the smallest pup, a boy named Finn, he let out a scream so sharp that the guards at the door flinched. His sisters, Wren and Tessa, joined him seconds later, their tiny faces turning red, their small fists beating against the blankets, as if trying to push the woman away. Lady Odette rose quickly, her cheeks burning with humiliation, and hurried from the hall without a word. She was the fifth to fail. There would be a sixth, and a seventh, and Draven feared there might be no end to the failures at all. He sat upon his throne at the far end of the hall, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his dark formal coat, his jaw locked so tightly that a muscle twitched near his ear. He was the Alpha King of Ironclaw, a man whose growl could silence a room, whose word could send armies marching. Yet in this moment, he felt as powerless as a boy, watching his world fall apart piece by piece. His mate, Queen Selene, had died the night the pups were born. The healers said her heart simply could not carry the weight of 3 lives at once. Draven remembered holding her hand as her breathing slowed, remembered the way she smiled even as her strength faded, telling him that their children would find their way, that the old bond magic never lied. He had believed her then. Now, watching 6 failed attempts in a single morning, his faith was beginning to crack. The choosing ceremony was an old tradition, one his own grandmother had performed 100 years before. When a pack's alpha lost his mate before the pups were grown, the children themselves would choose the woman who would raise them, guided by an instinct older than memory. It was said the bond could not be tricked, could not be forced, and could not be denied. A pup would simply know, the way a compass needle always finds north. But north, it seemed, was nowhere to be found in this room full of noblewomen. "Your Majesty," said Chancellor Oren, leaning close to the throne, with his hands folded behind his back, "perhaps we are being too hasty. There are still 12 more women waiting in the antechamber." Draven exhaled slowly. "Bring them in." One after another, they came. A duke's daughter with hair the color of wheat, who tried to sing a lullaby, only to have Tessa wail louder with every note. A merchant's niece who brought expensive toys shaped like little foxes, which Wren swatted away with a force surprising for such a small child. A baroness who wore a heavy floral perfume that made all 3 pups sneeze and cough until their nursemaid rushed them back from her outstretched arms. By midday, 17 women had tried, and 17 women had failed. The great hall, once buzzing with hopeful chatter, had grown quiet and tense. Servants exchanged nervous glances. Some of the older guards, who remembered the last choosing ceremony held generations ago, began to whisper that perhaps the pups were cursed, that perhaps losing their mother so young had broken something in them that no woman could ever fix. Draven refused to believe it. He would not let his children be called broken, not while he still drew breath. But even a king cannot argue with the truth sitting in front of him, and the truth was that his pups had rejected every single woman brought before them. "Your Majesty," Chancellor Oren said carefully, "shall we call for a recess? The children may simply be tired." Draven nodded, more out of exhaustion than agreement. "See that they are fed and given rest. We will resume in 2 hours." As the hall emptied, Draven remained seated a moment longer, staring at his 3 children now being carried away by their nursemaid, still fussing, still refusing to be soothed by anyone but each other. He rubbed a hand over his face and wondered, not for the first time that day, what Selene would say if she could see this. Far from the great hall, in a part of the castle where silk gowns and painted smiles meant nothing at all, a young Omega woman named Alira Marsh scrubbed a stubborn wine stain from a nobleman's shirt, with more force than the fabric probably deserved. The laundry courtyard sat behind the kitchens, a sunlit stone square lined with wooden basins, drying racks, and lines of fluttering linen. Steam rose from the washpots. Suds clung to Alira's forearms up to her elbows, and a streak of flour still marked her cheek from the morning shift she had picked up in the kitchens before her regular laundry duties began. She worked 2 jobs to help pay for her younger brother's medicine, and most days she barely noticed the ache in her back by the time the sun set. "You're going to wear a hole clean through that shirt," said Mabel, an older laundry woman working beside her. without looking up from her own basin. "It deserves it," Elira muttered, finally freeing the stain. Whoever spilled wine down the front of this thing was clearly not thinking about the poor soul who'd have to scrub it out. Mabel chuckled, a warm, tired sound. "You always did talk to the laundry like it could hear you." "Someone has to keep me company," Elira said, wringing out the shirt and tossing it onto the line. "The washboards certainly don't talk back." She had heard, of course, about the choosing ceremony happening somewhere deep in the castle that day. Everyone had heard. The kitchen staff had done nothing but gossip about it since sunrise, speculating on which noble family would end up with the honor of raising the king's pups. Elira found the whole affair strange and a little sad. 3 motherless children being paraded in front of strangers, waiting to see if their tiny bodies would somehow signal approval or rejection, as if love could be summoned on command in front of an audience. She thought of her own mother, gone 3 winters now, and how love had never once felt like a performance. It had felt like warm bread on cold mornings, and quiet songs sung off-key. It had felt like being held simply because holding was needed, not because anyone was watching. She pushed the thought away and reached for the next basin of dirty linens, her hands moving through practiced motions, her mind drifting toward the evening ahead when she would walk home to check on her brother. She had no way of knowing that deep inside the castle, a small boy named Finn had just stopped crying for the first time all day, his tiny nose lifting into the air, as if catching a scent carried faintly on a draft that had traveled farther than anyone would have thought possible. The nursemaid, a kind older woman named Greta, noticed the sudden quiet first. She had been pacing the nursery floor with Finn against her shoulder, murmuring soft nonsense to calm him, when his small body went still. His head turned, his round eyes fixed on the open window, and a tiny fist reached toward it, as though trying to grasp something only he could sense. "There now," Greta whispered, relieved. "Finally settling, are we?" But Finn did not settle. Instead, he squirmed with a fresh burst of energy, pushing against her hold, his little legs kicking as if trying to climb down and walk on his own, though he was far too young to manage more than a wobbly crawl. Greta frowned, shifting him in her arms, trying to soothe him back into stillness. It did no good. If anything, his fussing grew more determined, more purposeful, entirely different from the exhausted crying of earlier that morning. In the next room, Ren and Tessa lay in their shared cradle, having finally drifted into uneasy naps after the long parade of failed noblewomen. But within moments of Finn's strange stillness, both girls stirred at once, their small faces scrunching, their breathing quickening. Ren was the first to open her eyes, blinking rapidly, her head turning toward the same window that had captured her brother's attention 2 rooms away, though there was no possible way she could have seen or heard him from that distance. Tessa woke seconds later, immediately reaching for her sister, and together the 2 girls began to fuss in a rhythm that matched, almost perfectly, the sounds coming from Finn down the hall. The second nursemaid, a younger woman named Ivy, rushed to check on them, assuming hunger or discomfort. She lifted Ren first, checking her tiny hands and feet, finding nothing wrong, no fever, no visible distress beyond the same restless reaching toward the window that Finn had shown. "What's gotten into the lot of them?" Ivy muttered, glancing toward the door as Greta appeared, Finn still squirming determinedly in her arms. "I don't know," Greta admitted, her brow furrowed with concern. "I've never seen him like this. It's not hunger, it's not pain. It's almost like he's searching for something." The 2 women exchanged a worried look. In all their years caring for children of nobility, they had never witnessed anything quite like this strange, synchronized restlessness. It was unsettling in a way neither of them could fully explain, as though the pups had caught the scent of something the adults around them could not perceive at all. Word of the pups' unusual behavior reached Chancellor Oren within the hour, delivered by a breathless young page who had been sent running the moment Greta grew alarmed enough to summon help. Oren, ever practical, dismissed it at first as simple exhaustion catching up with the children after a long and stressful morning. But when he arrived at the nursery himself and saw all 3 pups straining toward the same window, their small bodies trembling with an urgency that seemed far too focused to be mere fussiness, even his practical mind began to wonder. "Have they been fed?" he asked. "Twice," Greta answered. "They won't eat. They keep turning their heads toward the window, toward the courtyard side of the castle." Oren walked to the window himself and looked out. Below, he could see the ordinary bustle of castle life continuing as normal. Servants crossing the courtyard with baskets of linen, a stable boy leading a horse toward the paddocks, smoke rising from the kitchen chimneys. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have captured the attention of 3 infants who had never once looked in this particular direction before. Perhaps a change of room would help, he suggested, though he did not sound entirely convinced by his own idea. Move them somewhere, without a view of the courtyard. It may simply be overstimulation. Greta nodded, though she did not look reassured, and gathered Finn more securely against her chest as she prepared to carry him toward a quieter chamber on the other side of the nursery wing. She never made it there. The moment they passed through the nursery door and into the long stone corridor beyond, Finn's squirming intensified into something close to desperation. His small body twisted with surprising strength, and before Greta could tighten her grip, he managed to slip one arm free, reaching down the hallway in the exact direction that would, several turns and staircases later, lead toward the castle's laundry courtyard. Greta had worked in the royal nursery for 11 years. She had raised 2 generations of noble children before these 3, and never once had she encountered a pup with this kind of single-minded determination. It frightened her a little, if she was honest with herself, the way his tiny body seemed to know exactly where it wanted to go, as though guided by something far older and far wiser than his few months of life could explain. "All right, little one," she murmured, deciding it might be easier to indulge his direction for a moment than to fight against it. "Let's see where you're so eager to go." She had no idea, as she turned down the corridor and began following the pull of his tiny reaching arm, that she was about to walk directly into the middle of a story the entire kingdom would soon be talking about. Behind her, Ivy struggled to keep pace while carrying both Ren and Tessa, who had grown just as insistent, their small heads turning in unison toward the same direction Finn pulled Greta, as though all 3 pups were tethered by some invisible thread that stretched from their hearts toward a single point, somewhere deep within the castle walls. The laundry courtyard, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the small storm heading its way. Alira had moved on from the wine-stained shirt to a mountain of bed linens, her sleeves soaked through, her hair escaping its braid in damp curls around her face. The afternoon sun had grown warm, and steam curled up from the washpots in lazy ribbons, carrying the scent of lye soap and clean cotton through the courtyard air. "You should take a break," Mabel said, noticing the tired slump in Alira's shoulders. "You've been at this since before dawn." "I'll rest when the basket is empty," Alira replied, though her arms did feel heavier than usual. "Besides, if I stop now, I'll never want to start again." Mabel shook her head with a fond, exasperated smile, the kind reserved for someone she had grown to care for over years of working side by side. "Your brother is lucky to have someone as stubborn as you looking after him." Alira's smile softened at the mention of her brother, the tiredness in her chest easing slightly at the thought of him waiting for her at home, probably reading by candlelight, despite her repeated warnings about ruining his eyes. "Stubborn is one word for it," she said. "Mother always called it foolish devotion." "Sounds like the same thing to me," Mabel teased, returning to her own basin. Alira laughed, a genuine warm sound that carried across the quiet courtyard, and continued scrubbing, her hands moving through soap and water with the ease of long practice. She had no reason to look up, no reason to notice the small commotion building somewhere inside the castle, no reason at all to suspect that her ordinary afternoon was about to change forever. She simply kept working, elbow deep in suds, humming softly to herself, entirely unaware that 3 tiny hearts, guided by a bond older than any crown or title, were being pulled steadily, insistently, unstoppably toward her. Greta rounded the final corner of the servants' passage with Finn still reaching ahead of her, his small fingers stretching toward the open archway that led out into the sunlit courtyard. She had followed his lead through 3 hallways and down one narrow staircase, growing more astonished with every step at how certain he seemed, how unlike an ordinary fussy infant he behaved. Ivy caught up moments later, slightly out of breath, with Ren and Tessa both craning their necks in the same direction as their brother. "This is madness," she said between breaths. "Since when do pups lead the way?" "Since today, apparently," Greta answered, stepping through the archway and into the warm afternoon light. The laundry courtyard stretched before them, busy with the ordinary sounds of scrubbing and wringing and the soft creak of drying lines swaying in the breeze. Several servants glanced up at the unexpected sight of two nursemaids carrying the king's pups through a part of the castle they had certainly never visited before. Whispers rippled instantly through the workers, hands pausing over washboards, heads turning. Finn's squirming reached its peak the moment his eyes landed on a young woman near the far basin, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, suds clinging to her forearms, a loose strand of hair falling across her face as she worked. He let out a sound unlike any of his cries from earlier that day. Not distress, but something closer to delight. A small, excited noise that made Greta's chest tighten with disbelief. Alira did not notice at first. She was focused on the linen in front of her, humming quietly, entirely unaware that the small commotion behind her had anything to do with her at all. It was only when Mabel's hand landed on her arm, urgent and firm, that she finally looked up.
"Alira,"
Mabel whispered, her eyes wide. "Look." Alira turned, wiping soap from her hands onto her apron, and found herself facing two nursemaids she vaguely recognized from castle gossip, each holding a small child, all three of whom were staring directly at her with an intensity that seemed far too focused for infants so young. She glanced around, half expecting to see someone else standing behind her, someone the children might actually be looking at. There was no one. "Can I help you?" she asked, confusion evident in her voice. Before Greta could answer, Finn resolved the confusion himself. With a burst of determined energy that startled everyone watching, he twisted free from Greta's loosened grip, and half crawled, half tumbled toward Alira, landing against her skirts with his tiny arms already reaching upward, demanding to be lifted. Alira froze for a moment, unsure what to do, glancing at Greta with wide, uncertain eyes. "I'm sorry. I don't understand. Is he supposed to be here?" "He's the king's son," Greta said, her voice trembling slightly with disbelief at what she was witnessing. "Please, just pick him up, see what happens." Hesitantly, Alira wiped her wet hands once more on her apron and knelt down, scooping the small boy into her arms with the same practiced gentleness she might use with any child. The moment Finn settled against her, his tiny body relaxed completely, his fussing dissolving into soft, contented sounds, his small hand reaching up to pat clumsily at the damp curls falling near her cheek. The courtyard fell silent. Even the steady rhythm of scrubbing and wringing paused as every servant present turned to watch the impossible scene unfolding before them. "He's never done that," Ivy murmured, still holding the two girls, who had begun straining just as insistently toward Alira as their brother had. "Not once, not with anyone." Alira looked down at the child, now nestled peacefully against her shoulder, his earlier restlessness completely gone, replaced by a calm so complete it seemed almost unnatural, for a pup who had reportedly been crying since dawn. "I don't understand," she said again, softer this time, more to herself than to anyone else. "Why would he want me?" "May I?" Ivy asked, stepping closer, gently extending Ren toward her. Alira shifted Finn to one arm and accepted the second child with the other, her heart hammering with a mixture of confusion and something she could not quite name. Ren, like her brother, settled instantly, her small fists unclenching, her earlier fussing replaced by soft, sleepy sounds of contentment. Tessa, still in Ivy's arms, began to wail with such urgency that Ivy hurried forward without waiting to be asked, practically pressing the last pup into Alira's already full embrace. Somehow, impossibly, Alira found herself balancing all three children at once, each of them calm, each of them settled, each of them pressed close against her soap-scented apron, as though they had found exactly where they belonged. Mabel stood frozen beside her, one hand pressed to her chest, tears welling unexpectedly in her eyes. "In all my years," she whispered, "I have never seen anything like this." Greta and Ivy exchanged a long, stunned look, both women clearly grappling with the significance of what had just occurred. This was no ordinary quieting of fussy children. This was the very bond the entire ceremony had been designed to reveal, appearing not in the great hall among silk gowns and noble titles, but here, in a humble laundry courtyard, in the arms of a young woman covered in suds and flour. "We need to inform His Majesty immediately," Greta said, her voice tight with urgency. "Wait," Alira said quickly, panic creeping into her voice, as the weight of the situation began to settle over her. "I don't know what's happening here. I'm nobody. I work in the laundry. I can't be involved in whatever this is." "I'm afraid," Greta said gently, though her tone carried an unmistakable seriousness. That you already are. Illyra looked down at the three small faces now peaceful against her. Their earlier distress entirely vanished, and felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Whatever this meant, whatever strange twist of fate had brought the king's own children crawling into her arms, she understood with sudden clarity that her ordinary life, the quiet routine of laundry and kitchen work, and evenings with her brother, was about to change in ways she could not yet begin to imagine. Around her, the courtyard remained eerily silent, every servant present staring in a mixture of awe and disbelief, none of them quite able to comprehend what they had just witnessed, and none of them able to look away. News of what had happened in the laundry courtyard spread through the castle faster than fire through dry grass. By the time a breathless page reached the great hall where Draven sat waiting for the second round of the choosing ceremony to begin, the story had already grown twisted and strange in the telling, some servants whispering of magic, others of a curse finally lifted, still others insisting the pups had simply grown tired, and any warm body would have done the same. Draven listened to the page's stammering report with a growing sense of disbelief. "Say that again," he demanded, rising from his throne. "All three of them settled? At once? With a laundry servant?" "Yes, Your Majesty," the page said, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the floor. "Nursemaid Greta says it happened the moment the young woman held them. All three, calm as anything, not a single cry between them." Chancellor Oren, standing nearby, frowned deeply. This must be a mistake. The bond does not simply appear by accident in a courtyard. There are protocols, rituals, a formal setting required for the choosing to hold any weight. "The pups do not care for your protocols, Chancellor," Draven said sharply, already moving toward the door, his long strides eating up the distance across the marble floor. "Take me there, now." The walk from the great hall to the laundry courtyard felt, to Draven, both impossibly long and far too short. Long, because every step carried the weight of disbelief, of hope he did not want to admit he was feeling, of fear that this might turn out to be some cruel misunderstanding after a day already filled with failure. Short, because he arrived at the archway leading into the courtyard before he had fully prepared himself for whatever he might find on the other side. What he found stopped him completely in his tracks. There, in the middle of a courtyard filled with washpots and drying linens, sat a young woman on an overturned wooden crate, her clothes still damp from her work, her hair falling loose from its braid, cradling all three of his children against her chest, as though she had done so 1,000 times before. Finn slept soundly against her shoulder. Ren's tiny hand curled around a lock of the woman's hair. Tessa, the fussiest of the three since birth, lay utterly content in the crook of her arm, her small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of peaceful sleep. Draven had not seen his children this calm since before Celine passed. The courtyard, already tense with the presence of 2 nursemaids, a small crowd of curious servants, and Chancellor Oren hurrying in behind him, grew utterly silent the moment the king appeared. Every servant present dropped into a hasty bow, except for the young woman herself, who seemed too startled, too overwhelmed by the sudden royal presence, to manage more than a stiff, awkward attempt at a curtsy, while still balancing 3 sleeping children. "Please," Draven said quickly, holding up a hand, "don't move. Don't wake them." Illyra froze halfway through her curtsy, unsure whether standing still, or attempting to complete the gesture, was the correct choice, in front of a king who had just told her not to move. She settled for a slightly crooked half-bow of her head, her cheeks burning with embarrassment at being caught in her work clothes, soap still drying on her hands, in front of the most powerful man in the kingdom. Draven approached slowly, his eyes moving between his children's peaceful faces and the young woman holding them, searching for some explanation, some sign of trickery or coincidence that might make sense of what he was seeing. He found none. Only 3 sleeping pups and a visibly frightened young woman who clearly had no idea what to make of the situation any more than he did. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice softer than the commanding tone he had used with Oren moments before. "Illyra, Your Majesty," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper, careful not to jostle the children. "Illyra Marsh. I work in the laundry, and sometimes the kitchens." "Illyra, Your Majesty," she answered. "Illyra, Your Majesty," Draven repeated, as though testing the weight of the name. "Tell me exactly what happened here." She recounted the story as best she could, her voice growing steadier as she spoke, though her hands remained carefully still, cradling the sleeping pups with an instinct that seemed to come naturally despite her nervousness. She explained how she had been working at the far basin, how she had turned to find the nursemaids and children already approaching, how Finn had crawled toward her before anyone could stop him, how his sisters had followed in behavior none of the adults present could explain. Draven listened without interrupting, his gaze occasionally drifting back to his children, to the peace on their small faces, a peace that had been entirely absent throughout the long, exhausting morning of failed introductions in the Great Hall. "This cannot simply be coincidence," he said finally, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned to Oren. "Chancellor, has such a thing ever happened before? A bond forming outside the formal ceremony?" Oren hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "The old texts do not forbid it, Your Majesty, though it is highly unusual. The bond is said to recognize what the heart already knows, regardless of setting or circumstance. If the pups have truly chosen, then the ceremony itself becomes something of a formality." Draven turned back to Alira, studying her more carefully now. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with tired eyes that spoke of long hours and hard work, hands roughened by years of scrubbing and washing, and an expression that held far more fear than ambition. There was nothing about her that suggested she had sought this moment, nothing that suggested trickery or scheming. If anything, she looked as though she wished desperately to be anywhere else. "You seem troubled," he observed. Alira swallowed hard before answering. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, but I don't understand what any of this means. I have no experience with royal children. I have no title, no proper education in courtly matters. I work in a laundry courtyard. Whatever your children seem to want from me, I fear I am not equipped to provide it." "And yet," Draven said quietly, glancing once more at his sleeping children, "they have chosen you regardless of your equipment or lack thereof." A tense silence settled over the courtyard, broken only by the soft creak of drying lines swaying overhead, and the distant sound of castle life continuing on, unaware of the significant moment unfolding within these humble walls. Servants exchanged uncertain glances. Chancellor Oren shifted his weight, clearly turning over the political implications of what this could mean for the noble families waiting anxiously in the Great Hall. Draven, meanwhile, found himself caught between the rigid expectations of tradition and a truth he could not deny sitting directly in front of him. His children, who had rejected every carefully chosen noblewoman presented to them that morning, had found peace in the arms of a laundry servant they had never met before today. It defied everything he had expected from this day, and yet it felt, in some strange way he could not fully articulate, exactly right. "We will discuss this further," he said finally, "somewhere more appropriate than a courtyard. Alira Marsh, you will accompany me, and bring the children with you, if they will allow it." Alira's eyes widened with alarm. "Your Majesty, I still have work to finish. My shift is not yet over, and my brother is expecting me this evening. He depends on me for—" "Your work here is finished for the day," Draven interrupted, not unkindly, but with the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to having his decisions followed without argument. "Someone will see to your brother's needs, and inform him you have been called to the castle on royal business. You will not be harmed, Alira Marsh, and you will not be forced into anything against your will. But I must understand what has happened here, and I suspect the answers will not come from standing in a laundry courtyard debating the matter." Alira looked down at the three small faces still peaceful against her, feeling the weight of an impossible situation settling heavily onto her shoulders. She had woken that morning expecting nothing more unusual than sore hands and a long day of scrubbing linens. Instead, she now found herself being summoned by the king himself, carrying his sleeping children in her arms, utterly uncertain of what her life would look like by the time the sun set that evening. With no real choice available to her, she nodded slowly, rising carefully from the wooden crate, cradling the pups against her chest as she followed the king out of the courtyard that had, until this very afternoon, been the entirety of her small, ordinary world. The private chamber Draven led her to was smaller than the Great Hall, but still grander than anything Alira had ever stood inside, with tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens and a fireplace large enough to roast an entire boar. She sat stiffly on the edge of a velvet chair, the three pups now awake and playing quietly on a soft rug near her feet, reaching occasionally for her skirts, as if reassuring themselves she had not vanished. Chancellor Oren stood near the door, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Draven paced slowly before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, clearly turning over thoughts he had not yet decided how to voice. "Tell me about your family," he said finally, stopping to look at her directly. Alira shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "There is little to tell, Your Majesty. My mother passed 3 winters ago. My father left before I can remember. It has been myself and my younger brother Callan since then. He is 12, and his lungs have never been strong. The medicine he needs is costly, so I work whenever work is available." "You have no other family, no husband, no intended match?" "No, Your Majesty. There has been little time for such things." Draven studied her for a long moment, and Alira found herself wondering what conclusion he was drawing from her plain, unremarkable answers. She was nothing like the noblewomen who had paraded through the great hall that morning, nothing like the polished, practiced women trained from birth for exactly this kind of moment. She had no dowry, no lineage worth mentioning, nothing to offer beyond calloused hands and a tired heart. "The bond your children share with you," Oren interjected carefully, "cannot be undone, Your Majesty. Once formed, it deepens with time, and separation only causes distress. If we attempt to force a different match now, the pups will suffer for it." Draven's jaw tightened. "I am aware of the consequences, Chancellor." "Then you understand the position this places us in," Oren continued. "The noble families waiting in the great hall will not easily accept a laundry servant raising the crown's heirs. There will be accusations. There will be resistance." "Let them resist," Draven said flatly. "I did not summon this bond into existence. Nor did Alira Marsh scheme her way into my children's hearts while scrubbing linens in a courtyard. Whatever magic guides this old ritual chose her, and I will not insult my own children's instincts to please the pride of noble families who failed to earn the same result." Alira listened to this exchange with growing unease, feeling very much like a piece of furniture being discussed, rather than a person with thoughts of her own. She cleared her throat softly, drawing both men's attention. "Forgive me, but might I have some say in this matter? I understand the bond exists, I felt it myself in the courtyard, but I have a life already, a brother who needs me, a job that pays for his care. I cannot simply abandon everything to raise children I have known for less than an hour." Draven's expression softened slightly at this, some of the rigid authority in his posture easing. "You misunderstand me, Alira Marsh. I am not asking you to abandon your brother. Bring him here, if you wish. The castle has healers far more skilled than any you could afford on a laundry servant's wages. His care would improve, not suffer." Alira blinked, caught off guard by the offer. "You would do that? For a stranger?" "You are no longer entirely a stranger," Draven said, glancing down at his children, who had grown quiet again, content simply to sit near Alira's feet. "Whatever this bond means, it has already made you something more significant to this family than a stranger could ever be." Ren, as if sensing the conversation revolved around her, chose that moment to pull herself up using the hem of Alira's skirt, wobbling unsteadily on 2 small feet before plopping back down with a delighted giggle. Alira could not help the small, surprised laugh that escaped her, reaching down instinctively to steady the child before she toppled sideways. Watching this small, natural moment, Draven felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he had carried since Celine's death, a tension he had grown so accustomed to that he had almost forgotten what its absence felt like. "I will not force you into a position you do not want," he said carefully. "But I ask that you consider staying, at least for a time, to see whether this arrangement might work for everyone involved, yourself included." Alira looked down at the 3 small faces, watching her with open, trusting curiosity, feeling the familiar tug of responsibility she recognized from years of caring for her brother. She did not understand the strange bond that had brought her here, could not explain why 3 royal children had chosen her out of everyone in the castle, but she found she could not simply walk away from them either, not when they looked at her the way Callan had looked at her every night since their mother died, as though she were the one steady thing in an uncertain world. "I will need to see my brother," she said finally. "I need to explain this to him myself, and I need to know he will be cared for properly." "Done," Draven said immediately. "I will send a carriage for him this evening." Chancellor Oren, still visibly uneasy about the political ramifications, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, The noble families are still waiting in the great hall. What shall I tell them? Draven's expression hardened again, the authority returning to his posture. Tell them the choosing ceremony has concluded. Tell them the pups have made their decision, and it is final. Oren hesitated, clearly wanting to argue further, but something in the king's expression discouraged him from pressing the matter. With a stiff bow, he excused himself from the chamber, leaving Draven and Alira alone with the three pups, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the weight of an uncertain future settling quietly over the room. Alira watched the chancellor leave, her stomach tightening with anxiety at the thought of the noble family's reaction to news that would surely humiliate them. They will not be pleased, she said quietly. No, Draven agreed. They will not. And you are certain this is wise? Choosing a servant over women of proper standing. Draven turned to look at her fully, his expression thoughtful. I have led this kingdom for many years, Alira Marsh. I have made countless decisions based on standing, on lineage, on the expectations placed upon a crown. Today, for the first time since my mate died, I watched my children find peace in someone's arms. I do not intend to question that peace simply because it arrived in an unexpected form. Alira held his gaze for a long moment, uncertain what to say to such an admission, feeling the weight of his words settle somewhere deep in her chest. Whatever waited for her beyond this room, whatever challenges the noble families or the castle itself might present, she understood now that there would be no simple return to her old, ordinary life. The path forward remained uncertain, but for the first time since the strange events of that afternoon began, she felt something unexpected mixing with her fear, a quiet, cautious curiosity about what this new chapter of her life might hold. The great hall erupted the moment Chancellor Oren delivered the news. Lady Odette, still smarting from her earlier rejection, was the first to speak, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmuring crowd. A laundry servant? You cannot possibly expect us to accept such an announcement. This is an insult to every family gathered in this hall today. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled nobles, growing louder with each passing second. Duchess Priya rose from her seat, her expression a mixture of outrage and disbelief. The choosing ceremony has clear rules, Chancellor. It must be conducted properly, witnessed by the court, verified by the appointed elders. What proof do we have that this bond is genuine, and not some elaborate scheme, cooked up by an ambitious servant seeking to elevate her station? I understand your concerns, Oren said carefully, raising his hands in an attempt to calm the growing unrest. But I witnessed the bond myself. All three pups responded to her presence in a manner consistent with the old texts. There is no ceremony formal enough to override what the children themselves have already chosen. Chosen, scoffed Lord Barrett, a heavy-set noble whose daughter had been among the first to try and fail that morning. Infants do not choose anything, Chancellor. They react to warmth, to comfort, to whoever happens to be holding them at the moment. This so-called bond is nothing more than coincidence, dressed up in old superstition, to justify the king's questionable decision. The hall grew louder still, voices overlapping in a chaotic mixture of outrage, disbelief, and calculated political concern. Several nobles began discussing among themselves what this might mean for their own standing at court, whether this decision could be challenged, whether pressure might be applied to reverse what many considered an unacceptable outcome. Oren allowed the noise to continue for a moment longer, before raising his voice above the din. I remind you all that this decision comes from His Majesty himself, and questioning the judgment of your king in open court carries consequences you would be wise to consider carefully. The reminder had its intended effect, quieting the loudest voices, though the tension in the room remained thick and unresolved. Lady Odette sat back down slowly, her expression still tight with resentment, while Duchess Priya exchanged a meaningful glance with several other nobles seated nearby, a silent communication that suggested this matter was far from settled in their minds. Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of the castle, Alira sat in a small guest chamber that had been hastily prepared for her, watching as a castle-maid helped arrange a simple but clean dress for her to change into. She felt entirely out of place, surrounded by such unfamiliar luxury, her rough, work-worn hands looking wrong against the soft fabric offered to her. You needn't look so frightened, the maid said kindly, noticing Alira's tense expression. The children clearly adore you already. That's more than most noblewomen ever manage. It isn't the children I'm frightened of, Elira admitted quietly. The maid's expression turned sympathetic. The nobles will grumble, that's certain. But His Majesty is not a man easily swayed once he's made a decision. You'd do well to trust that, even if trusting anything about today feels impossible right now. Elira nodded, though the knot of anxiety in her stomach refused to loosen. She thought of her brother, likely confused and worried by now at her failure to return home at the usual hour, and hoped the carriage Draven promised had already been sent to collect him and explain the situation as gently as possible. Her worry proved unfounded sooner than expected. Within the hour, a soft knock announced the arrival of Callan himself, escorted by a castle guard who looked slightly bewildered by the entire situation, clearly unaccustomed to delivering children rather than messages or orders. "Elira!" Callan burst into the room the moment the door opened, his thin frame nearly knocking her over as he threw his arms around her. "They said you're staying at the castle now, that the king's own children chose you somehow. Is that true? Is it really true?" Elira laughed despite herself, hugging her brother tightly, relief flooding through her at the sight of his familiar face. "It's true, though I understand it about as well as you do." Callan pulled back, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and disbelief that only a 12-year-old could manage in the face of such an extraordinary turn of events. "This is incredible. You're basically going to be royalty now. Does this mean I get to live here too? Will there be real doctors? The guard said something about healers who could actually help with my breathing." "Slow down," Elira said, though she could not help smiling at his enthusiasm. "Nothing is certain yet. This is all still very new and very strange, and I don't fully understand what my place here will be. But you'll figure it out," Callan said, with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted his sister's ability to handle whatever life threw at them. "You always do." Elira wished she shared his confidence, but the weight of the noble family's anger, the uncertainty of her new role, and the strange bond she still could not explain, all pressed heavily against her chest. She held her brother close for a long moment, grateful at least for his presence in this unfamiliar new world, a single familiar constant amid so much sudden change. Later that evening, after Callan had been settled into a nearby chamber and introduced to a castle healer who promised to examine him properly the following morning, Elira found herself standing alone near the tall window of her own temporary quarters, watching the sun set over gardens more beautiful than anything she had seen in her entire life. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Draven standing in the doorway, his expression more relaxed than it had been earlier that day, though still carrying the weight of a man who had faced considerable resistance from his court. "I wanted to see how you were settling in," he said. "As well as can be expected, Your Majesty, given the circumstances," Elira answered honestly. "The nobles are unhappy," he admitted, stepping into the room. "I will not pretend otherwise. There will likely be more resistance in the days ahead, perhaps attempts to challenge the legitimacy of the bond, or pressure applied through political channels I cannot always control." Elira's stomach tightened at this admission, though she appreciated his honesty more than false reassurance. "And what happens to me if that pressure succeeds?" Draven's expression turned serious, his gaze steady on hers. "It will not succeed, Elira Marsh. I give you my word on that. Whatever challenges arise, I did not bring you into this castle only to abandon you to the whims of nobles, who care more for their pride than for the genuine well-being of my children." Something in his voice, some quiet, unwavering certainty, eased a portion of the anxiety that had settled in her chest since the strange events of that morning. She did not fully trust this new world she found herself in, did not fully understand the bond that had brought her here, but she found, despite everything, that she believed the sincerity behind his words. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for bringing my brother here, and for your patience with someone as unprepared for all of this as I am." Draven offered a small, genuine smile, the first she had seen from him since their strange meeting in the laundry courtyard. "You are not as unprepared as you believe, Elira Marsh. My children certainly seem to think so, and I have learned, more than once today, to trust their instincts over the expectations of everyone else in this castle." The days that followed settled into a strange new rhythm, unlike anything Elira had ever known. Gone were the early mornings spent scrubbing linens until her hands ached, replaced instead by early mornings spent chasing 3 increasingly mobile pups through the nursery, catching Wren before she toppled off the edge of a rug, or coaxing Tessa into eating her morning porridge without flinging half of it across the room. Callan, meanwhile, thrived under the care of the castle healers. Within a week, his breathing had improved noticeably, the persistent wheeze that had worried Alira for years growing quieter with each passing day of proper medicine and rest. He spent his afternoons exploring the castle grounds under the watchful eye of a young stable hand who had taken a liking to him, returning each evening full of stories about horses and hidden passages and the strange, wonderful world he now found himself living in. Alira found herself growing steadily more comfortable with the pups, discovering an ease with them that surprised her, given how little experience she had with children beyond her own younger brother. She learned Finn's habit of tugging at his ear when tired, learned that Wren refused to nap without a particular soft blue blanket clutched against her cheek, learned that Tessa's fussiness eased almost instantly with quiet, off-key humming, the same tunes Alira's own mother used to sing. Draven, too, found himself drawn increasingly into the nursery, initially out of a sense of duty to check on his children's well-being, though he soon found himself lingering far longer than duty required. He would arrive expecting a brief visit and find himself still sitting on the nursery floor an hour later, watching Alira coax Finn into taking his first wobbly steps, or listening to her patiently explain to Wren why pulling a cat's tail was unkind, even if the cat in question seemed remarkably tolerant of the abuse. "You have a gift with them," he observed one evening, watching Alira gently untangle Tessa's small fingers from a fistful of her own hair. "I've had practice," Alira replied, wincing slightly, as Tessa gave one final tug before releasing her grip entirely. "Callan was a fussy baby too, or so our mother always told me." "It's more than practice," Draven said, settling onto the floor across from her, an action that would have scandalized the noble court had they witnessed their king sitting so casually among nursery toys and scattered blankets. "There's patience in you that cannot be taught, only lived." Alira felt warmth rise to her cheeks at the observation, unsure how to respond to praise from a man whose opinion, she was slowly realizing, mattered to her more than she had expected it might. "I suppose growing up with responsibility teaches you things noble tutors never could. Perhaps that is precisely why my children chose you," Draven said thoughtfully, "not despite your background, but because of it." Their conversations, initially formal and cautious, gradually grew easier over the following weeks, filled with small moments of shared laughter over the pups' antics, quiet discussions about castle life, occasional debates about the best way to handle Tessa's stubborn refusal to eat vegetables. Alira found herself looking forward to these evening visits more than she cared to admit, found herself noticing the way Draven's serious expression softened whenever Wren climbed into his lap uninvited, found herself thinking about him at odd moments throughout her day, when she had no reasonable excuse to be thinking of the king at all. Not everyone in the castle shared her growing sense of ease, however. The noble families, as Draven had warned, did not accept the outcome of the choosing ceremony gracefully. Whispers followed Alira through castle corridors, sharp glances from noblewomen, who felt personally slighted by her unexpected rise, muttered comments about servants who forgot their proper place, about kings who allowed sentiment to override sound judgment. Lady Odette, in particular, seemed determined to make her displeasure known at every opportunity. She would appear unexpectedly in hallways Alira frequented, offering pointed comments disguised as polite conversation, remarking on how quickly some people adjusted to luxuries they had never earned, how curious it was that infants could apparently determine matters of state better than generations of careful noble breeding. Alira did her best to ignore these comments, focusing instead on the children who needed her, on her brother's improving health, on the small, unexpected comfort she found in Draven's company. But the tension simmering beneath the surface of castle life could not be ignored forever, and she sensed, with a growing unease she could not quite shake, that the noble family's resentment was building toward something far more significant than simple gossip and cold glances. One afternoon, while walking through the castle gardens with Tessa balanced on her hip, Alira encountered Duchess Priya seated on a stone bench near the fountain, her expression carefully composed into polite neutrality that did not quite mask the calculation beneath it. "Alira Marsh," the Duchess said pleasantly, gesturing toward the empty space beside her. "Won't you join me for a moment?" Alira hesitated, wary of the invitation, but unwilling to appear rude by refusing outright. She settled carefully onto the bench, keeping Tessa secure against her, watching the Duchess with cautious attention. "You've adjusted remarkably well to castle life," Priya observed, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "Considering your background, I mean no offense by the observation." "None taken," Illyra said carefully, though she suspected offense had been precisely the intention. "I imagine it must be difficult, though," Priya continued, "carrying such responsibility when you lack the proper education, the proper training, that noble children receive from birth, specifically, to prepare them for positions of influence. Surely you must feel the weight of your inadequacy at times." Illyra held the Duchess's gaze steadily, refusing to let the pointed words shake her composure, though her heart beat faster with the effort of maintaining calm. "I feel the weight of responsibility, Duchess, as any caretaker would. I cannot speak to inadequacy, as the children in my care seem quite content with whatever I provide them." Priya's smile tightened slightly at the measured response. "For now, perhaps. Children are notoriously fickle creatures, easily swayed by novelty. One wonders how long such contentment might last, once the novelty wears thin, once they begin to notice the gaps in their education, in their exposure to proper courtly manners and traditions." "I appreciate your concern," Illyra said, rising carefully from the bench. Tessa still balanced securely against her. "But I believe I shall continue doing my best, regardless of whatever doubts others may harbor about my suitability." She walked away, before the Duchess could respond further, her hands trembling slightly despite her outward composure, the pointed words echoing uncomfortably in her mind long after the conversation ended. She understood, with growing clarity, that this quiet resentment, simmering among the noble families, would not simply fade away with time. If anything, it seemed to be building toward something, gathering strength in the shadows of polite conversation and careful political maneuvering, waiting for the right moment to strike. That evening, as she settled the pups into their cradles for the night, Draven arrived for his usual visit, immediately noticing the tension still lingering in her expression, despite her attempts to mask it. "Something is troubling you," he observed, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact. Illyra hesitated, uncertain how much to share, unwilling to burden him with concerns that might seem trivial compared to the weight of ruling an entire kingdom. But something in his patient, steady gaze encouraged honesty rather than deflection. "Duchess Priya spoke with me in the gardens today," she admitted finally. "She suggested, quite pointedly, that I lack the proper qualifications to raise your children, that my inadequacy would eventually become impossible to ignore." Draven's expression darkened, a flash of protective anger crossing his features before he carefully composed himself. "The Duchess overstates her authority on matters that do not concern her." "Does it not concern her, though?" Illyra asked quietly. "I am raising the future heirs of this kingdom, Draven." Perhaps her concerns are not entirely unfounded. It was the first time she had used his name without title, and the word hung between them for a moment, unexpected and significant. Draven did not correct her, did not remind her of proper address or courtly formality. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression softening into something gentler than the anger that had flashed there moments before. "You have given my children more genuine peace and comfort in these past weeks than any amount of noble education could provide," he said firmly. "Whatever gaps exist in your formal training can be taught, Illyra. What cannot be taught is the instinct you carry naturally, the patience, the warmth that drew them to you in the first place. That is not inadequacy. That is precisely the quality this kingdom needs in whoever raises its future." Illyra felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion at his words, felt something warm and fragile blooming in her chest, that she was not entirely prepared to examine too closely. "Thank you," she managed finally, "for saying so." "I mean every word," Draven said quietly, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety. "Do not let the Duchess's bitterness convince you otherwise." The letter arrived on a gray, overcast morning, delivered by a nervous young page who seemed reluctant to hand it over at all. Chancellor Oren read it twice before summoning Draven to his private study, his expression grim as he passed the parchment across the desk. "They've formed an alliance," Oren said without preamble. "Duchess Priya, Lord Barrett, and several other prominent families. They're petitioning for a formal review of the choosing ceremony, questioning its legitimacy, and demanding an independent panel of elders examine whether the bond you witnessed was genuine or somehow manipulated." Draven's jaw tightened as he read through the carefully worded but unmistakably hostile letter. Manipulated by whom exactly? Do they accuse Alira of sorcery now, in addition to ambition? They stop short of naming specific accusations, Oren said carefully, but the implication is clear enough. They believe something unnatural occurred, something that circumvented proper tradition, and they intend to use whatever influence they possess to see the matter formally investigated. And if this panel of elders rules against the bond's legitimacy? Draven asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Then legally, Your Majesty, you would be expected to reopen the choosing ceremony, this time under stricter, more formal conditions that exclude anyone outside noble birth from participating. Draven set the letter down with more force than necessary, his hands curling into fists against the desk. This is nothing more than wounded pride, dressed up in false concern for tradition. Perhaps, Oren agreed, but wounded pride, backed by enough noble signatures, carries real political weight that could destabilize your court if handled carelessly. I would advise caution, Your Majesty. A direct refusal to entertain their petition may only strengthen their resolve and draw more families to their cause. Draven paced the length of the study, his mind racing through possible responses, none of which felt entirely satisfactory. He had promised Alira protection, had assured her that whatever challenges arose would not succeed, and now he found himself facing precisely the kind of organized political resistance he had hoped to avoid. Summon the elders myself, he said finally. If they insist on a formal review, then let it be conducted properly, transparently, with witnesses present who cannot be accused of bias. I will not hide from this challenge, Oren. I will meet it directly, and I will prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the bond my children share with Alira Marsh is genuine. Oren nodded slowly, though concern remained evident in his expression. And if the elders somehow rule against you, despite genuine evidence? Draven's expression hardened with quiet, unwavering determination. Then I will find another way to protect what matters most, regardless of what any panel decides. News of the noble petition reached Alira later that same day, delivered gently but honestly by Draven himself during his evening visit to the nursery. She listened with growing alarm as he explained the situation, her hands instinctively tightening around Ren, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder moments before. They want to take them from me, she said quietly, more statement than question. They want to challenge the legitimacy of the bond, Draven corrected gently, though he understood the distinction likely offered little comfort. But I do not intend to let that challenge succeed, Alira. I have already summoned the elders for a formal review. And what happens during this review? She asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. Witnesses will testify to what they observed in the courtyard that day. The elders will examine the pup's behavior directly, comparing it against historical accounts of genuine bonding. It will not be pleasant, and it will likely be humiliating, given the accusations implied by the noble family's petition. But I believe, once conducted honestly, the outcome cannot reasonably favor anyone but you. Alira absorbed this information slowly, fear and determination warring within her chest. She thought of the past several weeks, of Finn's first wobbly steps taken directly into her waiting arms, of Ren's insistence on sleeping only with her particular blue blanket clutched close, of Tessa's fussiness melting away the moment Alira began humming her mother's old, off-key lullabies. Whatever the noble families believed about legitimacy or tradition, she knew, with unshakable certainty, that what existed between herself and these three children was genuine, regardless of what any formal review might conclude. I will testify honestly, she said finally, straightening her shoulders with newfound resolve. I will not pretend to be someone I am not, nor will I apologize for a bond I never sought, but cannot deny exists. Draven's expression softened with something close to admiration. That is precisely the courage I hoped you would find. The formal review took place 3 days later in the Great Hall, filled once again with noble families, castle staff, and a panel of 5 elderly elders, whose weathered faces betrayed nothing of their opinions, as they settled into their designated seats at the front of the assembly. Alira stood before them, dressed simply but neatly, her hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling, while Greta and Ivy took turns describing the events of that first extraordinary afternoon, in careful, measured detail. Lady Odette, called forward to represent the concerns of the petitioning families, spoke at length about tradition, about proper ceremony, about the dangers of allowing sentiment to override established practice. Her words were carefully chosen, avoiding direct accusation, while still implying, through careful phrasing and pointed emphasis, that something suspicious lingered beneath the surface of this unusual bond. When it came time for the elders to examine the pups directly, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. Finn, Ren, and Tessa were brought forward, initially calm in the arms of their nursemaids, but growing increasingly restless the longer Alira remained separated from them across the hall. Within minutes, all three pups had begun fussing with familiar, unmistakable urgency, straining against their caretaker's arms, reaching toward the woman standing anxiously near the elders' panel. The eldest of the 5 elders, a stern woman named Matron Blythe, whose reputation for fairness was well known throughout the kingdom, rose slowly from her seat and gestured for Alira to approach. The moment Alira lifted Tessa into her arms, the fussing stopped entirely, replaced by the same instant, peaceful contentment that had first appeared in the laundry courtyard weeks before. Matron Blythe watched this transformation with careful, calculating attention before turning to address the assembled crowd. I have witnessed the ancient bond ritual only twice in my many years of service to this kingdom, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. What I observed today matches precisely the accounts recorded in our oldest texts. This is no trickery, no manipulation, no coincidence born of simple warmth or comfort. This is the genuine bond our tradition describes, appearing exactly as it should, regardless of the unconventional circumstances surrounding its formation. A ripple of reaction moved through the assembled nobles, some faces showing grudging acceptance, others still tight with barely concealed resentment. Lady Odette's expression remained stony, though she said nothing further, clearly recognizing the futility of continued argument against such definitive testimony. The panel's ruling is unanimous, Matron Blythe continued, glancing toward her fellow elders, who each nodded their agreement in turn. The bond between Alira Marsh and the 3 royal pups is genuine, valid, and binding, according to the oldest traditions of this kingdom. Any further challenge to this ruling would constitute a direct challenge to tradition itself, a position I doubt any family present truly wishes to occupy. The words settled the matter with a finality that left little room for further dispute, though Alira could still feel the weight of resentful glares from certain corners of the hall. She held Tessa close, relief flooding through her chest, as the formal ruling confirmed what she had known, in her heart, since that very first afternoon in the courtyard. Draven approached her once the crowd began dispersing, his expression carrying a quiet pride that warmed her more than the formal ruling itself had managed. You handled yourself with remarkable grace throughout all of this, he said softly. I had good reason to fight for what mattered, Alira replied, glancing down at Tessa's peaceful, sleeping face. I could not simply let them take this away, regardless of how frightened I felt standing before that panel. You did not appear frightened, Draven observed. You appeared exactly like a woman who belonged precisely where she was standing. Alira felt warmth rise to her cheeks at the observation, meeting his gaze with a newfound confidence that had not existed within her before this difficult, uncertain journey began. Whatever challenges still awaited her in this unfamiliar world of castle politics and noble resentment, she understood now, with unshakable certainty, that she possessed the strength necessary to face them, one determined step at a time. Despite the elders' ruling, not every member of the noble court accepted defeat gracefully. In the weeks following the formal review, Alira noticed a change in the quality of the resentment directed her way. Where before it had been open, almost careless in its bitterness, it now grew quieter, more calculated, hidden behind polite smiles and carefully neutral conversation that never quite masked the coldness underneath. Lady Odette, in particular, seemed to have withdrawn from open confrontation entirely, which Alira found more unsettling than the Duchess's earlier pointed remarks had ever been. She caught glimpses of Odette, deep in quiet conversation with other disgruntled nobles in shadowed corners of the castle, conversations that ended abruptly whenever Alira happened to walk past, replaced by falsely bright smiles and empty pleasantries. You're imagining threats where none exist, Mabel told her one afternoon, when Alira mentioned her unease during a rare visit back to the laundry courtyard to check on old friends. The ruling was clear. There's nothing left for them to do but accept it. I hope you're right, Alira said, though the knot of worry in her stomach refused to fully loosen. Her instincts, as it turned out, were not misplaced. Late one evening, several weeks after the formal review concluded, Elira woke to the sound of hushed voices outside the nursery door, voices that did not belong to any of the usual castle staff assigned to nighttime duty. She rose quietly from her chair beside the pups' cradles, moving carefully toward the door, straining to make out the muffled conversation happening just beyond it. "Simply need access during the changing of the guard," one voice was saying, low and urgent. "Once they're away from the castle grounds, the bond becomes irrelevant. A new choosing can be arranged, this time properly, without interference." Elira's blood ran cold as the implication settled fully into her understanding. Someone intended to remove the pups from the castle entirely, believing that physical separation might somehow undo the bond that had proven so resistant to political challenge. She did not hesitate. Moving as quietly as possible, she gathered all three sleeping children into her arms, waking them gently despite the late hour, before slipping through the connecting passage that led toward the guest chamber, where Draven typically retired for the night. She knocked urgently, relief flooding through her when he answered almost immediately, still dressed, clearly having been awake reviewing documents by candlelight. "Elira, what's happened?" His expression shifted instantly from confusion to alarm at the sight of her carrying all three children, fear evident in her wide eyes. "There are people outside the nursery," she said quickly, her voice trembling with barely controlled panic. "I heard them discussing removing the pups from the castle, something about arranging a new choosing, once they're beyond the bond's reach." Draven's expression darkened with immediate, protective fury. He called for the castle guard captain without hesitation, his commands sharp and urgent, setting into motion a search that would sweep through the entire castle grounds within minutes. Elira remained in his private chamber with the children, her heart still pounding from the close call, while Draven personally oversaw the effort to identify whoever had been lurking outside the nursery door. The culprits, when finally apprehended near a side entrance leading toward the stables, turned out to be two minor nobles, distantly connected to Lord Barrett's household, along with a hired mercenary who had been paid to assist in the attempted removal. Under firm questioning, the nobles quickly revealed the extent of the conspiracy, implicating both Lord Barrett and, more troublingly, suggesting Duchess Priya's knowledge and tacit approval of the plan, though she had been careful enough to avoid any direct, provable involvement herself. By dawn, both minor nobles and the mercenary had been taken into custody, while Lord Barrett found himself summoned before Draven for immediate questioning, his composure crumbling rapidly under the weight of undeniable evidence and witness testimony. This was meant to protect proper tradition, Barrett insisted, though his voice lacked conviction as he faced Draven's cold, furious expression. The pups would have been perfectly safe, simply removed temporarily, until a proper ceremony could. "You conspired to steal my children from their beds in the middle of the night," Draven interrupted, his voice deceptively calm, in the way that Elira had learned, over these past weeks, indicated dangerous, barely restrained anger. "There is no version of tradition that justifies such an act, Lord Barrett, and you will answer fully for this transgression." Barrett's noble title, once considered untouchable within the political hierarchy of the kingdom, offered little protection against the severity of his actions. Within days, his lands were seized, his standing at court permanently revoked, and he was exiled from the kingdom entirely, a fate that sent a clear, unmistakable message throughout the remaining noble families about the consequences of challenging the crown's decision through underhanded, dangerous means. Duchess Priya, despite the strong suspicion of her involvement, managed to avoid direct punishment due to insufficient concrete evidence linking her to the conspiracy itself. However, her reputation suffered considerably from the association, and she found herself increasingly isolated from the political influence she had once wielded so confidently throughout the court. For Elira, the frightening ordeal left lingering marks of anxiety that took time to fully fade. She found herself checking on the pups more frequently throughout the night, startling at unexpected sounds echoing through the castle corridors, unable to fully relax, despite the reassurance that the immediate threat had been neutralized. Draven noticed her continued distress and found himself spending even more time in the nursery during those difficult nights, sitting quietly beside her as she watched over the sleeping children, offering silent companionship that gradually helped ease the sharp edges of her fear. "I should have anticipated something like this," he said one night, guilt evident in his tired voice. I promised you protection, and instead, you found yourself facing danger I failed to foresee. You could not have known, Illyra said softly, though she appreciated the sincerity behind his regret. And you acted swiftly, once the threat became clear. That matters more than the impossibility of predicting every danger before it arises. Regardless, Draven said firmly, I intend to ensure nothing like this happens again. Additional guards will be stationed throughout the nursery wing, and I will personally review the loyalty of every member of staff with access to this part of the castle. Illyra reached out instinctively, resting her hand gently against his arm, a gesture that surprised them both with its easy familiarity. Thank you, she said quietly, for taking this so seriously, for making certain the children remain safe. Draven glanced down at her hand, still resting against his arm, then met her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. Their safety matters more to me than anything else in this kingdom, he said quietly, and I find, more and more each day, that your safety has become equally important to me as well. The admission hung in the quiet air between them, unexpected and significant, neither of them quite ready to examine fully what such a statement might mean for the careful boundaries they had maintained throughout these past difficult weeks. But something had shifted in that moment, something neither of them could easily deny, a warmth growing steadily between them, that neither political scheming nor noble resentment had managed to extinguish. In the months that followed the failed conspiracy, life within the castle gradually settled into a calmer, steadier rhythm. The pups grew stronger and more confident with each passing week, Finn now toddling determinedly through the nursery on increasingly sturdy legs, Wren babbling constant nonsense syllables that she seemed convinced constituted perfectly clear conversation, Tessa developing a stubborn independence that kept everyone, including Illyra, thoroughly entertained and occasionally exhausted. Callan, too, continued to flourish under the castle's care. His health improved dramatically enough that he had begun assisting the stable hands with basic chores, delighting in the responsibility, despite Illyra's occasional worry that he was pushing himself too hard too quickly. He had grown taller in recent months, his cheeks filled out with proper nutrition and consistent medicine, looking nothing like the fragile, wheezing boy who had first arrived at the castle gates. Illyra herself had changed as well, though the transformation felt less visible, more internal. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that had not existed within her during those first frightened days in the laundry courtyard. The noble court, while still occasionally cool toward her, had largely accepted her presence as an unavoidable, if uncomfortable, reality. Even Duchess Priya, isolated and diminished in influence, had grown noticeably more cautious in her interactions, offering polite, if strained, courtesy whenever their paths happened to cross. Her relationship with Draven, meanwhile, had deepened steadily, in ways neither of them had explicitly planned nor fully discussed, though both felt the shift keenly with each passing day. Their evening visits to the nursery had extended naturally into shared meals, quiet walks through the gardens after the children were settled for the night, conversations that ranged from castle politics to childhood memories to hopes neither had previously voiced aloud to anyone. "Tell me about your mother," Draven asked one evening, as they walked slowly along a garden path, lit by soft lantern light, the autumn air carrying a gentle chill that hinted at the approaching winter season. Illyra smiled softly at the question, memories rising easily to the surface. She was stubborn, much like me, according to everyone who knew her. She worked herself to exhaustion most days, yet always found the energy for a song before bed, even when her voice cracked with tiredness. I think of her every time Tessa refuses to settle without humming. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, Illyra agreed, though I don't think she ever believed herself remarkable. She simply did what needed doing, day after day, without complaint, without expecting recognition for any of it. Draven glanced at her thoughtfully. That sounds remarkably similar to someone else I've come to know rather well these past months. Illyra felt warmth rise to her cheeks at the comparison, though she found herself unable to look away from his steady, sincere gaze. I hardly think scrubbing linens compares to whatever hardships my mother endured. Perhaps not identically, Draven allowed, but the underlying quality remains the same, a willingness to give everything of yourself for those who depend on you, without ever once expecting praise or reward for the sacrifice. They had reached a small stone bench overlooking the castle's central fountain, and Draven gestured for her to sit, settling beside her with a careful, deliberate closeness that had grown increasingly natural between them over recent weeks. The moon had risen fully overhead, casting silver light across the quiet gardens, the only sound the gentle trickle of water from the fountain, and the distant, muffled noise of castle life continuing somewhere beyond the garden walls. "I never expected any of this," Elira admitted quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "When I woke that first morning, scrubbing wine stains from a nobleman's shirt, I could never have imagined where the day would eventually lead." "Nor could I," Draven agreed. "I expected the choosing ceremony to conclude with a suitable noblewoman selected, a straightforward political match that would satisfy tradition and provide my children with proper guidance. Instead, I found myself facing something far more unexpected and far more valuable than I initially understood."
"Valuable how?"
Elira asked softly. Draven turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a quiet vulnerability she had rarely witnessed from the man who ruled an entire kingdom with such steady, unwavering authority. "I lost my mate before I truly understood how deeply I had come to depend on her presence, her companionship, the quiet comfort of simply not facing each day entirely alone. I convinced myself, after her passing, that such companionship belonged only to my past, that my remaining purpose lay solely in raising my children and governing this kingdom as best I could manage." He paused, reaching hesitantly for her hand, a gesture she allowed without hesitation, her fingers curling naturally around his own. "These past months with you have reminded me that purpose and companionship need not remain separate pursuits. Watching you with the children, sharing these quiet evenings together, I find myself hoping for a future I had long since given up believing possible." Elira's heart raced at his words, emotions swelling in her chest that she had spent considerable effort trying to suppress throughout these recent weeks, uncertain whether her growing feelings for him represented something genuine or merely the natural closeness born from their shared responsibility toward the children. "I feel it too," she admitted softly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I have tried to convince myself these feelings stem only from proximity, from the bond the children share with me, somehow extending unfairly toward their father as well. But I know, in my heart, that what I feel for you exists entirely separate from my connection to Finn, Ren, and Tessa." Draven's expression softened with unmistakable relief and joy at her admission. He lifted her hand gently, pressing a soft, reverent kiss against her knuckles, the gesture carrying more weight and sincerity than any elaborate courtly declaration could have managed. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "we might allow ourselves to explore what this feeling could become, without the fear of noble expectation or political consequence clouding our judgment." "I would like that," Elira whispered, "very much." They remained together on that quiet garden bench for a long while afterward, speaking softly of small, ordinary things, the weight of their earlier admission settling comfortably between them, like a warm blanket against the autumn chill. For the first time since her strange, unexpected arrival at the castle months before, Elira allowed herself to imagine a future, stretching beyond mere duty and obligation. A future built instead on genuine affection, mutual respect, and the quiet, steady partnership she had witnessed so clearly demonstrated within her own mother's memory. Word of their growing relationship spread quickly through the castle in the days that followed, though this time, the reaction among most staff, and even several previously skeptical nobles, carried more warmth than resentment. The transformation in Draven's demeanor since Elira's arrival had not gone unnoticed, his previously heavy grief gradually replaced by a lighter, more genuine contentment that even his harshest critics found difficult to argue against. Chancellor Oren, initially cautious about the political implications of such a relationship, eventually offered his own quiet blessing after observing the sincere happiness evident in his king's countenance during their private discussions. "I confess," he admitted one afternoon, "I did not expect a laundry courtyard to produce the answer to concerns I had long believed unsolvable. Perhaps tradition occasionally requires unexpected circumstances to reveal its truest wisdom." Elira, overhearing this admission during a brief visit to Oren's study regarding the Pups' upcoming winter celebration preparations, could not help the small, satisfied smile that crossed her features. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever resentment might occasionally resurface among the more stubborn noble families, she understood now, with unshakable certainty, that she had found genuine belonging within these castle walls. a belonging built not upon lineage or noble breeding, but upon the far sturdier foundation of love, freely given and gratefully received. Winter settled over the kingdom of Ironclaw with a quiet, gentle beauty, blanketing the castle grounds in soft white snow that delighted the pups endlessly. Despite the challenge of keeping 3 curious toddlers from wandering too far into the drifts during their outdoor play sessions, Elira found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, chasing Finn through the snow while Wren attempted, with limited success, to build what she insisted was a proper snow fortress, and Tessa contentedly ate more snow than any reasonable person should probably consume in a single afternoon. Draven watched these moments with quiet joy, often abandoning important council meetings earlier than strictly necessary to join in the outdoor festivities, much to Chancellor Oren's exasperated but ultimately affectionate disapproval. The kingdom, sensing the genuine happiness radiating from their king, seemed to embrace a lighter mood as well. Winter celebrations planned with unusual enthusiasm throughout the castle and surrounding villages. It was during preparations for the kingdom's traditional midwinter festival that the final challenge to Elira's position arose, though this time the threat came not from noble scheming, but from a source far more difficult to combat: doubt planted carefully within Elira's own heart. The festival traditionally required the reigning alpha to present his intended mate publicly before the assembled kingdom, a ceremony steeped in centuries of tradition that formalized romantic commitments before the entire court and common people alike. Draven had made clear his intention to present Elira during this year's festival, a declaration that would effectively silence any remaining noble resistance, while formally acknowledging their growing relationship before the entire kingdom. But as the festival date approached, old insecurities Elira had believed long since conquered began resurfacing with unexpected intensity. She found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ornate ceiling of her chamber, wondering whether she truly belonged in such a significant public role, whether the kingdom's people would ever fully accept a former laundry servant standing beside their king during such an important, traditional ceremony. "You've grown quiet these past few days," Draven observed one evening, noticing the distracted, troubled expression she had been unable to fully hide, despite her best efforts. Elira hesitated, uncertain how to voice fears that felt, in some ways, embarrassingly small, compared to the genuine dangers they had already faced together. "I worry," she admitted finally, "about the festival, about standing before the entire kingdom as your intended mate. The nobles have grudgingly accepted my role with the children, but this feels different, more permanent, more visible than anything we've faced before." Draven's expression softened with understanding, rather than dismissal of her concerns. "Tell me specifically what frightens you." "What if the people reject the idea entirely?" Elira asked, her voice smaller than she intended. "What if they see only a laundry servant standing where a proper queen should be, regardless of whatever bond exists between myself and your children?" Draven took her hands gently in his own, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Do you remember what Matron Blythe said during the formal review, when she confirmed the legitimacy of your bond with our children? That it matched precisely the accounts recorded in the oldest texts," Elira recalled. "Precisely," Draven agreed. "The old traditions this kingdom holds so dear never once specified that worthiness depended upon noble birth or courtly education. They speak only of genuine bonds, genuine love, genuine commitment freely given. You embody every one of these qualities more fully than any noblewoman I encountered during that long, exhausting day of failed introductions months ago." Elira felt tears welling unexpectedly in her eyes at his sincere reassurance, though doubt still lingered stubbornly at the edges of her heart. "I want to believe that will be enough." "It will be," Draven said firmly, "because I intend to make certain of it myself, before the entire kingdom, during the festival presentation." The night of the midwinter festival arrived with clear, star-filled skies stretching above the castle grounds, where enormous bonfires blazed cheerfully amid crowds of villagers, nobles, and castle staff, all gathered together in rare, unified celebration. Elira stood nervously near the edge of the main courtyard, dressed in a simple but elegant gown that Draven had insisted upon, watching the festivities with a knot of anxiety tightening steadily in her stomach as the appointed hour for the formal presentation approached. "You look beautiful," Callan said beside her, his own excitement at the festival's spectacle evident despite his attempt to offer serious, brotherly encouragement. Draven's a fool if he doesn't recognize how lucky he is. Alira managed a small, grateful smile despite her nerves. Thank you, Callan. Though I suspect he recognizes it quite well already. The formal presentation began with traditional announcements from Chancellor Oren, followed by a ceremonial procession that led Draven, dressed in formal royal attire, toward the raised platform positioned at the courtyard's center, where the assembled crowd could witness the proceedings clearly. Alira watched from the platform's edge, her heart pounding, as the moment for her own participation drew steadily closer. When Chancellor Oren finally called her name, inviting her forward to join Draven upon the platform, Alira felt momentarily frozen, the weight of hundreds of watching eyes pressing heavily against her resolve. But then she caught sight of Finn, Ren, and Tessa, seated safely nearby with Greta and Ivy, all three children reaching excitedly toward her, their small faces bright with uncomplicated joy at the festival's excitement. Drawing strength from their simple, unwavering trust, Alira stepped forward, climbing the platform steps to stand beside Draven before the entire assembled kingdom. Draven turned to face her, then addressed the crowd with a voice carrying clear, unwavering authority across the quiet courtyard. Many of you witnessed, months ago, an unprecedented event within our great hall, when my children rejected every noblewoman presented during their formal choosing ceremony. Fewer of you witnessed what followed, when those same children found immediate, undeniable peace within the arms of a laundry servant working in our castle's courtyard. A murmur passed through the crowd, though Draven continued before the reaction could gain momentum. I confess, initially, I questioned this outcome as deeply as many of you likely did. Tradition suggested one path, while the genuine bond my children demonstrated suggested another entirely. I have since learned, through months of careful observation and genuine personal experience, that tradition itself values precisely this kind of authentic connection, above all superficial markers of noble birth or courtly polish. He turned to face Alira directly, his expression carrying open, unmistakable affection that drew soft, approving murmurs from portions of the watching crowd. Alira Marsh has given my children more genuine love and stability than any formal ceremony could have guaranteed. She has weathered noble resistance, political scheming, and even danger to her own safety, all while continuing to provide steady, patient care to children who are not even her own by blood, yet who love her as completely as any child could love a mother. He paused, reaching for her hand, his thumb brushing gently against her knuckles as he continued. I stand before you today, not merely to present my intended mate, as tradition requires, but to declare openly that I have found, in this remarkable woman, a partner whose worth extends far beyond any measure of birth or title. Her heart, her strength, and her unwavering devotion to those she loves represent everything this kingdom's oldest traditions were truly meant to honor. The courtyard fell into a hushed, expectant silence as Draven's words settled over the assembled crowd. Then, breaking the silence unexpectedly, Mabel's voice rang out from somewhere near the courtyard's edge. She scrubbed my linens beside me for 3 years and never once complained, despite carrying burdens most nobles couldn't imagine enduring. If any woman deserves this honor, it's Alira Marsh. A ripple of agreement followed Mabel's declaration, spreading gradually through the crowd as more voices joined in support. Common villagers and castle staff who had witnessed firsthand Alira's genuine character throughout her years of humble service, before fate had intervened so dramatically. Even several nobles, moved by the sincerity evident in both Draven's declaration and the crowd's genuine response, offered polite, if somewhat reserved, applause. Alira felt tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the unexpected wave of support surrounding her, by the genuine warmth evident in Draven's expression as he watched her reaction. Whatever lingering doubts had plagued her in recent days dissolved entirely beneath the weight of this moment, this public acknowledgement of a bond that had proven, time and again, far stronger than any obstacle placed before it. Alira Marsh, Draven said, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet courtyard. Will you accept my hand, not merely as caretaker to my children, but as my equal partner in ruling this kingdom, in raising our family, and in building whatever futures awaits us together? Yes, Alira answered, her voice steady, despite the tears still glistening on her cheeks. With all my heart, yes. The crowd erupted into genuine celebration, cheers and applause echoing across the snow-covered courtyard, as Draven pulled her into a warm, tender embrace, the formal presentation concluding with a promise of partnership built not upon political convenience, but upon the far sturdier foundation of genuine love, mutual respect, and a bond that 3 small children had recognized long before anyone else within the castle walls had been willing to see it clearly. As the festival celebrations continued long into the starlit winter night, Alira found herself surrounded by her growing family, Finn asleep against Draven's shoulder, Ren and Tessa curled contentedly in her own arms, Callan laughing nearby with newfound friends among the castle staff. Whatever unexpected turns her life had taken since that ordinary morning scrubbing wine stains from a nobleman's shirt, she understood now, with complete and unshakable certainty, that she had found exactly where she belonged. Not because tradition or ceremony had declared it so, but because 3 small hearts, guided by instinct purer than any noble breeding could produce, had recognized a truth that took the rest of the kingdom considerably longer to fully understand, that genuine love, wherever it is found, deserves nothing less than complete and joyful acceptance.